I've lived in Maplewood Estates for 14 years, long enough to see the seasons change 100 different ways. But there was always one constant in my life here, the great sycamore in my front yard. It was older than the neighborhood itself, a towering sentinel with bark-like weathered armor and branches that stretched out like a cathedral's ceiling, casting cool, dappled shade over the front porch where I drank my coffee every morning. I didn't plant it, but it felt like mine in a way that went beyond ownership. It had been here before me, before the HOA even dreamed of existing, before Maplewood Estates was a neat little enclave of manicured lawns and quarterly newsletters, full of self-congratulation. Over the years, the sycamore became my landmark, my piece of living history. Neighbors walking their dogs would stop under its shade to chat. Kids would collect its giant leaves in the fall, and in the summer, I strung fairy lights through its lower branches so the whole front yard glowed softly at night. But to the HOA, it was never a symbol of beauty. It was non-compliant, a word they loved to throw around like it meant something sacred. At first, their complaints came in a trickle, a note about leaf litter in the gutter, a warning about overhanging branches that might impede visibility. I responded politely, pointing out that the tree was perfectly healthy, inspected annually, and presented no hazard to anyone. But the letters kept coming, growing sharper in tone, as if the very sight of that sycamore offended them. And then, one afternoon, while I was at work, I came home to find an orange ribbon tied around the trunk and a notice nailed to it. Scheduled for pruning to HOA specifications. I called the number on the paper immediately, but the woman at the other, and the HOA president herself, assured me it was routine maintenance and nothing to worry about. She said it with that clipped, condescending tone that makes you feel like you're already in the wrong for asking. That night, I barely slept. I knew what HOA specifications meant. They wanted conformity, and my sycamore stood out. Too much, too tall, too old to fit into their picture-perfect model. The next morning, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee and stared at the ribbon, my stomach twisted into knots. I had half a mind to cut it off myself, but a nagging voice in my head told me they'd just tie another one while I wasn't looking. Days passed with no sign of the trimming crew, and I almost let myself hope they'd dropped it. Then, one Friday, while I was on a video call in my home office, the low rumble of a truck engine rolled down my street. I glanced out the window, and there it was, a white pickup with the HOA's logo on the door, towing a wood chipper. Two men in neon vests hopped out, chainsaws hanging from their belts. I bolted outside before they even got the tailgate down. "What do you think you're doing?" I demanded. One of them shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "Got orders from the HOA to prune the tree back to regulation height." Regulation height. I almost laughed, as if nature gave a damn about their rule book. I told them flat out they weren't touching it, that they had no authority without my consent. They paused, exchanged a look, and the shorter one pulled out his phone. A minute later, a silver SUV rolled up and out stepped Linda Carter, the HOA president, in her beige slacks and pastel blazer, clipboard in hand. She smiled that tight, insincere smile I'd seen at countless board meetings. "This will only take an hour," she said sweetly, "and it will make your property more visually harmonious with the neighborhood." I told her the tree was staying as it was. She tilted her head as if I were a stubborn child and informed me that I was in violation of 3 separate landscaping bylaws. I asked her to show me where in the covenants it said my decades-old sycamore couldn't stand taller than my roofline. She promised she'd send the paperwork, then turned to the crew and said, "Go ahead." I stepped in front of them, heart pounding, knowing I was about to make an enemy I couldn't unmake. She glared at me, her voice dropping to a cold whisper. "This tree will be cut. You can't stop us forever." It was the first time I realized this wasn't about safety or visibility or even rules. It was about control. About reminding me that in Maplewood Estates, the HOA didn't just govern the houses. They believed they owned the people who lived in them. I didn't know it yet, but that sycamore was about to become the battlefield where we'd fight our quiet little war. And I was ready to dig in for the long haul. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind of quiet, sunlit day when the only sounds are birdsong and the occasional hum of a lawnmower in the distance, and maybe that's why the sudden growl of diesel engines outside hit me like a thunderclap. I was halfway through a mug of coffee in the kitchen when I caught the movement through the front window. 3 trucks this time, not one, all white with the HOA logo stenciled on the doors, and behind them, a massive flatbed carrying a rented boom lift, the kind you'd use to gut a 100-year-old oak. I felt my pulse spike before I even stepped outside, because deep down I knew they hadn't come for a friendly chat. I strode down the porch steps and met them at the curb, the same 2 crewmen from before, plus a new guy with a hard hat who seemed to be the foreman, and there, stepping out of her car like a general surveying a battlefield, was Linda Carter. Pastel blazer replaced with a wide-brimmed sun hat and sunglasses, clipboard in hand, the picture of self-importance. "We're here under emergency bylaw enforcement," she said before I could open my mouth, flipping a page on her clipboard as if the words she'd printed there were divine law. "Tree poses a hazard to community aesthetics and safety and, per Section 14C, subsection 4, the board has authorized immediate corrective action." I laughed in disbelief, not because it was funny, but because it was so brazen, and told her flat out I had not given permission, that this was my property, my tree, and they were trespassing. She gave a little shrug, as if to say, "We both know you can't stop this," and motioned to the crew. What followed felt like watching someone take a chainsaw to my childhood dog, the high whine of the blade starting up, the vibration in the air as they raised the boom lift, and then the first bite of metal teeth into living wood, the sycamore shuddering as pale, fresh-cut chips rained down onto the lawn. I shouted, I threatened legal action, I even called the police, but when the officer arrived, he barely looked at the scene before muttering that, "It's a civil matter," and telling me to take it up with the HOA. Meanwhile, Linda stood with her arms crossed, smirking faintly every time I raised my voice, like she was savoring every second of my helplessness. They didn't just prune it, they butchered it, lopping off entire limbs, stripping away the canopy that had shaded my home for decades, until only a jagged, unnatural crown remained. The trunk still stood, but it was half the height it had. Been that morning and the yard looked naked, exposed, wrong. When the crew finally packed up, Linda walked over, handed me a violation notice for failure to maintain compliant landscaping, and in a tone sweet enough to rot teeth, said, "Now your property will fit in nicely with the rest of the neighborhood." I stood there in the sawdust, my hands clenched, heart pounding so hard it hurt, and in that moment, a part of me wanted to lash out, to scream until my throat tore. But another part, the colder, quieter part, was already thinking about the long game. Because as I stared at the stump and the mutilated branches, I realized something. They had turned my tree into an eyesore. But that meant I now had a blank canvas. And if there's one thing you can count on, it's that petty tyrants like the HOA hate attention unless they're the ones controlling it. So I decided right then and there that if they wanted to make my yard a spectacle, I would give them a spectacle so big, so magnetic, that the entire county would come to see it, and the HOA would have no choice but to choke on their own rules. Revenge, I knew, wasn't just about getting even. It was about making sure they never forgot who they picked a fight with. The morning after they mutilated my sycamore, I woke up to the sight of that awkward, amputated trunk staring back at me from the window, and instead of letting the anger wash over me like it had the day before, I felt something else, a kind of cold, deliberate clarity, the same feeling I get when I'm about to start a complicated project and I already know exactly how it's going to end. I grabbed a notebook, sat at the kitchen table, and started sketching ideas. Not for replacing the tree, but for transforming what was left into something so spectacular that even people who'd never heard of Maplewood Estates would make the trip just to see it. The HOA had taken something beautiful and tried to turn it into a warning, a public example of what happens when you defy them. But I was going to flip that script and make it into a symbol of defiance itself. I called up my friend Mark, a local woodworker and chainsaw sculptor whose work I'd admired for years at the county fair. He was the kind of guy who could look at a block of raw timber and see an eagle mid-flight or a bear ready to pounce. And when I explained what happened, he laughed and said, "Oh, I've been dying to carve something the HOA couldn't ignore." Within days, we had a plan. He'd transformed the trunk into an intricately detailed sculpture of a massive phoenix, wings spread wide as if it were about to take off into the sky, the bird's chest puffed out in defiance, every feather carved with precision. It would be unmistakable, unapologetic, and impossible to remove without making the HOA look even worse. We started work on a Saturday morning, the hum of his tools drawing curious glances from passing joggers and dog walkers, and within hours, people were stopping to take pictures, their phones clicking as the rough outline of the phoenix began to emerge from the once proud trunk. Mark worked for 3 weekends straight, and each time the crowd grew. Kids on bikes, retirees with folding chairs, even a local news reporter who said she'd heard something was happening in Maplewood Estates and wanted to see for herself. By the time Mark carved the final feather and stained the wood to a deep, rich amber, the story had already made it to the county's Facebook groups, and someone had started an Instagram account just for the phoenix. It had hundreds of followers. Before the week was out, I set up a small bench under the tree, planted a ring of flowers around the base, and hung a discreet sign that said, "Rise Again, in memory of the sycamore that stood here since 1893. People loved it. They'd sit, take photos, and share them online with captions about resilience and standing tall against petty authority. And every time they tagged the location, the HOA's pristine little neighborhood became associated, not with conformity, but with rebellion. Linda, of course, was livid. I could see her driving past slowly in her SUV, sunglasses hiding her eyes but not the tightness in her jaw, and I knew she was scrambling to figure out how to spin this. The problem for her was that the phoenix didn't violate any landscaping bylaws. It was still the same tree, still rooted in my yard, and nothing in the covenants prohibited artistic enhancement of natural vegetation. The more she fumed, the more people came, and the more people came, the more the HOA's carefully curated image cracked. By midsummer, weekends in front of my house looked like mini-festivals, with food trucks parking on the corner and amateur photographers staging shoots under the phoenix's wings. And the HOA's complaints were drowned out by the constant stream of praise from residents and outsiders alike. What had started as an act of spite on their part had become my greatest act of revenge. Because now, every time someone came to admire the phoenix, they were reminded of what the HOA had done and how I'd turned their petty vandalism into a monument they could never erase. By late summer, the phoenix had become more than just a sculpture in my yard. It was a pilgrimage site, a backdrop for engagement photos, graduation portraits, even a few music videos. Every time I opened Instagram, I'd see it tagged in. New posts, usually with captions about strength and rebirth, and that burned Linda more than I could have hoped. She stopped waving at neighbors, stopped her morning walks, and every time she passed my house, she'd accelerate just enough to let me know she didn't want to linger. I thought maybe she'd given up, that she realized the HOA had lost this battle and was moving on, but I should have known better. People like Linda don't let go, they just bide their time. The first sign came in the form of a certified letter, thick envelope with the HOA's crest stamped on it, claiming, "My sculpture constituted an unapproved exterior modification and demanding its removal within 14 days. I laughed out loud. They were trying to reframe it as construction instead of landscaping. But I knew the bylaws inside and out by now, and nothing in them supported her argument. I wrote back, citing chapter and verse, and copied the HOA's attorney just to make sure they knew I wasn't bluffing. A week later, on a Wednesday night, I was watching TV when my neighbor banged on the door, out of breath, shouting, "They're trying to take it down!" I ran outside and sure enough, under the glare of portable work lights, a crew in reflective vests was unloading chainsaws and ropes at the base of my yard, with Linda standing a few feet away, arms crossed like she was supervising an execution. I yelled at them to stop, but Linda was ready. She had a printed emergency removal order she claimed was authorized by the county. Too bad for her, I had already anticipated something like this. Earlier that summer, after the Phoenix started drawing attention, I'd applied to have it designated as a heritage art installation by the local historical society, citing the tree's age and the community's cultural response. The paperwork had gone through 2 weeks prior, and the Phoenix was now legally protected from removal without a public hearing. I pulled the laminated certificate from my porch and held it up under the work lights like a knight brandishing a sword. The crew hesitated, glanced at Linda, then packed their tools back up. No one wanted to be caught on video destroying something with legal protection. And oh yes, there were videos. Half a dozen neighbors had their phones out, live streaming the whole thing, and by morning, the clip of Linda retreating to her SUV while the crowd jeered had racked up over 100,000 views. Local news picked it up, then regional outlets, all spinning the same narrative. HOA tries to destroy beloved Phoenix sculpture, gets shut down. Advertisers started calling me about holding small sponsored events at the site, and I let them. Not because I needed the money, but because every dollar that flowed into my yard was another reminder to the HOA that they'd created a tourist attraction they couldn't control. By fall, the HOA board was in shambles. 2 members resigned, Linda stopped attending meetings altogether, and a petition circulated to dissolve the association entirely. I didn't push for that myself. I didn't need to, because my point had already been made. I'd turned their petty, spiteful act into a story people told with a smile, into a symbol of what happens when you stand your ground against small-minded authority. The Phoenix's wings caught the first frost in November, each feather rimmed in silver, and I stood on my porch that morning, coffee in hand, watching a couple from 2 towns over take selfies in front of it. It was my reminder that revenge doesn't always come in the form of a fight. Sometimes it comes in the form of making the thing they tried to destroy bigger, louder, and more loved than they could ever have imagined. The HOA had cut my tree in half, but I'd made it immortal.